This is Engineer Nasir from NCENT. Now we are going to make study about the duct construction standards. We will learn how to select the duct sheet gauge and reinforcement. What is the relationship between duct sheet gauge and reinforcement? How we can select different gauges of duct using reinforcement. The basic element of duct construction consists of duct walls, transverse joints, reinforcement at joints and between joints, and supports. All of these form an integrated combination for each pressure class and duct size. Each size in a pressure class has a minimum duct wall thickness and minimum specification for joints and reinforcement. On your screen you can see a table from SMACNA, and this table is called duct construction table. The duct construction table defines relationship between static pressure, width, wall thickness, reinforcement spacing, and reinforcement strength so that ducts have adequate strength and acceptable deflection limits. The greater dimension of a duct determine the duct gauge for all the four sides. This is applicable to both reinforced and unreinforced duct. As we know, duct is fabricated according to the specific duct pressure classification for its application, and for different pressure classes we have different tables in SMACNA. It starts from half-inch water gauge and it is up to 10-inch of water gauge. So you can use the table according your application. You can find from the SMACNA. Now we will discuss in detail how to use this table for the fabrication of duct. Duct construction can be classified in two types, with reinforcement and without reinforcement. Let us see duct construction without reinforcement first. Duct sites having a gauge listed in the second column of table 1-3 to 1-9 do not need reinforcement. Flat type joints may be used at any spacing. Flat slips and drives must not be less than 2 gauge lower than the gauge of duct or below 24 gauge. For example, for a duct fabrication of 2-inch water gauge pressure class, you can see from this construction table, in the first column this is showing the duct larger size of the duct, and the second column is showing the duct gauge without reinforcement. You can see the first column is showing the larger side of the duct and the second column is showing the duct gauge without reinforcement. If we have the larger side of the duct 10-inch, then we need to use the 26 gauge thickness of the sheet for fabrication of this duct without reinforcement. If we have 13 to 14 inch larger side of the duct, then we need to go for a sheet of 22 gauge thickness for the fabrication of this duct without reinforcement. If we have 19-20 inch side of the duct, then we need to use 18 gauge of duct. In the same way, we can use up to the size of 24 inch of larger side, a gauge of 16 gauge thickness without using reinforcement. If we need to use the lower gauge, then we need to go for the reinforcement, and we will discuss under the topic of reinforced duct. Now we will discuss the fabrication of duct with reinforcement. As we know, in SMACNA we have different duct fabrication table according to the pressure class. We have different tables from 1-3 to 1-9. For our study, let us select a table for 2-inch water gauge pressure class. With the help of this table, we will try to understand how to select a combination of duct gauge thickness and reinforcement grade. In the table on top, you can see these are the spacing between reinforcement. You can have the spacing of 2 feet, 2.5 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet, 6 feet, 8 feet and 10 feet. For each spacing we have different combination of duct sheet gauge and reinforcement grade. The first column in the table is showing the larger side of the duct. Assume that we have a duct that is having the larger side 16 inch. Then we will go across this duct side horizontally under the column of reinforcement spacing. Then we will have different cells showing the different combination of duct sheet gauge and the reinforcement grade. If we are going to use a spacing between reinforcement of 10 feet, then we need to use a combination of 22 gauge thickness of sheet and a reinforcement of C grade. You can see the difference. If you are fabricating a duct for the side of 16 inch without reinforcement, then you need to use a gauge of 20 gauge. But if you are going to use a combination of reinforcement and the duct sheet, then you can go for a lower grade of duct gauge 22 gauge with a combination of reinforcement of C grade at the spacing of 10 feet. If you need to use a lower grade of gauge for the duct sheet, then you can go for another reinforcement spacing column. Then you need to provide a reinforcement at spacing of 8 feet, but you need to use a combination of 24 gauge thickness of sheet with a reinforcement class grade C at the spacing of 8 feet. It means for a fabrication of a duct having a larger side of 16 inch, you can use a 24 gauge sheet having a reinforcement of C grade with a spacing of 8 feet. If you need to reduce the spacing 2 to 6 feet, you need to use the same combination. But if you can use the reinforcement at lesser spacing, that is 5 feet, then you can have a combination of lesser grade of duct gauge 26 gauge with a combination of C reinforcement grade at a spacing of 5 feet. In the same way, if you can provide the reinforcement at lesser spacing up to 2.5 inch, then you can have a combination of 26 gauge of sheet with a reinforcement grade of B. So you can see from this, and for the size of duct having larger side 16 inch, if we are not going to use the reinforcement, then we need to use a gauge of 20 a sheet of 20 gauge. But if we can use the reinforcement at the spacing of 10 feet, then we need to use a combination of gauge 22 and with a combination of reinforcement of C grade having a spacing of 10 feet. If we can minimize the spacing of reinforcement, then we can use 24 gauge of sheet thickness with the combination of C grade of reinforcement but lesser spacing, that is 8 feet. In the same way, you can go for lower grade also 26 gauge thickness of the sheet having a reinforcement of C grade but with a lesser spacing of 5 feet. Again, if you need to have different combination also with a reinforcement of B grade instead of C grade with a gauge of 26, then you need to use a lesser spacing between the reinforcement, that is 2.5 inch or 2.5 feet or 2 feet. So in this way, for the side of 16 inch of duct, You can use 20 gauge thickness of sheet, 22 gauge thickness of sheet, 24 gauge thickness of sheet, 26 gauge of thickness of sheet, with a different combination of reinforcement with different spacing. So the fabrication of duct using reinforcement allows us to use different gauges as per our choice, but we need to follow the specific spacing between the reinforcement and specific grade of the reinforcement.